This story is from when I was a teenager and just started high school. My friends and I lived in a town that, at the time, had a lot of farmland. Near my house, a mall had recently been made, so my friends and I tried to ride our bikes to go shopping one day. We missed our turn and instead wound up on a long road with a small downhill slope that ran through some farmland. Having never been to the mall before, and never having been down this road, we assumed it would lead us to the mall. Instead, this road twisted and turned through thicker and thicker woodland after the farmland ended. At the end of the road, there was an abandoned old house that was visibly falling apart. My friends and I simply turned around and found our way to the mall that day. But we ended up coming back time and time again because the road was long and had just enough of a slope to make your bike go faster than you could pedal. One day, we ended up daring each other to go into the house. Up until this point, we had never gone into it. My friends dared me to go in because I was pretty confident it would be safe if I was careful. So I did. It was a pretty empty house with some old moldy furniture. There were holes in a lot of the floor space. One Halloween's Eve, we went back to the house to play hide and seek for giggles. We brought a few other of our friends, as it was going to be a pretty fun time, or so we thought. At first, everything went all right. We played a few rounds, and some of the girls were sneaking away with their boyfriends off to the woods to make out. But we kept playing. Eventually, I went into the building to hide again, and noticed that while there was a ladder up to the attic, there was a hole I could climb through that led to a more secluded spot of the attic, where I couldn't be seen as easily. I thought to myself, this is the perfect hiding spot, and climbed onto it. I had brought a flashlight, so I turned it on, but kept the light on low to the floor, in order not to give away my position outside. I started looking around when I noticed a flash. It was the reflection from a pair of Nike shoes. Someone was already up here. I raised the light to see who else was already up here, but it wasn't one of my friends. He was dressed in torn up clothing. I only held the light over him for a second before noping out of the attic. It took me about 3 seconds to squeeze back through the hole, but the guy stood still, not even acknowledging that I had ever been near him. I told my friends, and we all decided to stop playing and go outside to look at the attic, as part of me was exposed by a hole on the side of the roof, and there was a window that the guy was standing near. Nobody could see him through the hole, so we went to look at the window. We saw a guy with a crazed look in his eyes, and we just bolted. One of us told their parents, and they called the police. The police did not find the person. However, what they did find makes me glad I got out of there as soon as I did. The police found 7 fingers, with 3 being the right index finger, and a human head mounted on the windowsill of the attic. We weren't looking at the guy I had seen. We were looking at a corpse. Apparently that house was being used by a gang, and it was so out of the way and unimportant that nobody ever went to it aside from us. What's more, they found a machete on a tarp where I had seen the guy, and several traps inside the house meant to catch intruders if they tried to sneak into the attic through the ladder. So, guy in the empty house Let's not meet. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to a new house. Both my parents worked pretty hard, and it was always just me and my sister, late into the evenings until my parents arrived, sufficiently drained and exhausted to give us the mandatory kiss on the cheek, dinner, and collapse on the couch. They were hard times. This house was a rental, but we liked it all the same. There was one part, however, that I did not enjoy, that being the basement. In truth, there wasn't a lot down there. Mostly just boxes with things that we didn't need or didn't need yet. Stuff that wouldn't look appropriate in our new house, as my mother said. We hardly ever went down there. There were few opportunities that required us to fetch things, except of course seasonal decorations and the like. I remember it must have been about July. We had been in the house for something like 8 months, and one day, as I'm passing the kitchen, I notice that the basement door is ajar. Now, even though none of us ever go in here, this didn't strike me as odd at first, and I simply closed the door and went about my business. A few days later, the same thing. This time, it's ajar, but nearly closed, almost looking like someone had made a hasty retreat and forgotten to close the door properly. I approached the door with curiosity, still resigning it to the normal and thinking that there were nothing wrong with this situation. I just opened the door slightly, peered down the dark and foreboding steps, and then quietly closed the door with a creak. I closed it and went back to my room to do whatever I was doing. It was around this time that I also started to hear things. The TV room was located just above the basement stairs and door, with the kitchen on the other side and the stairs sort of separating the two. As I was watching TV, it was an ad break, and I was listening intently. All of a sudden, I hear something. I turn the volume of the TV down and can make out the sound of footsteps as slowly and as quietly as possible, trying to make their way up the stairs. I quietly make my own way to the stairs, throw open the door, and am greeted with nothing. But I did hear the panicked sounds of heavy breathing, and perhaps the last 3 footfalls of someone hitting the solid wooden stairs and getting to the bottom. I was quite confused. I called my mum and dad to check it out, asking them to see if there was a man in the basement. But when they returned from their trip down, they told me that there was nothing that they could find. Keep in mind, I never explicitly told them what was down there or what was wrong, so when they asked me what was wrong, I said I thought I heard something and didn't elaborate in the details. They told me that it was probably just a rodent and to not worry about it. I nodded my head, agreeing with them, and carried on with my day. But the noises persisted. Infrequent as they were, I would hear shuffling, things moving about, and my fear of the basement only grew. I began worrying that our basement was haunted, that there was some dark entity living underneath our house. In a moment of bravery, I confronted my sister and asked her if by any chance she had heard or experienced anything unusual in the basement or heard things from it. Without missing a beat, she fills me in that she has been hearing creepy stuff from the basement, and as her room is opposite the basement door, she tells me that there are times when she's going to sleep that she hears footsteps. Someone open the basement door quietly and make their way over to her room. She hears the door creak and then always hides under her blankets. I asked her why she never told Mum and Dad, and she said the one time she screamed for them, which I didn't know as I'm a very heavy sleeper, when they came in to investigate, there was no one there, so she didn't know if she was going mad or not. It was in this time that we, together, decided that we had to investigate. So when we got home from school that day, we grabbed a flashlight and a weapon from the kitchen. We descended the wooden stairs into the blackness, switched on the light switches, and turned on the flashlights for added protection. We scoped around the place, top to bottom, as best as a 12-year-old can do, I suppose, to check out what we could find. There wasn't much. We couldn't find any trace that the man was down here, leading us to believe there was a more paranormal element to our haunting. Just before we resigned ourselves to leave, did I notice something odd? Right by one of the boxes, there were a few things thrown about just outside, like someone had pushed it over and knocked the contents in a hurry. I walked over to look. It were the Christmas decorations. Weird, I thought. I put down a bauble and looked at my feet. And then, after moving the box slightly to the right, did I notice a trap door handle. Our basement was actually made of dirt, so the handle of a hatch was very out of place, very conveniently covered up so that no one would find it amongst all the clutter and a few bits that were left by the old house. We looked at each other, pushed one of the boxes aside, and considered looking down. My sister, being the bravest of the two, pulled the flap open quietly, as it was very creaky, and looked down into the abyss. That's when she saw a light at the very end, and a man talking to himself. He was being loud and rude, and my sister quietly and quickly closed the hatch as fast as she had opened it. She ran upstairs, called my mum and dad, and told them exactly what the situation was. She then called the police, who came extremely fast, even beating my parents, and went downstairs to arrest the guy. Turns out that underneath our basement, there are a few little tunnels that connects some of the shops and businesses around town. Naturally, these businesses had to seal their exits once they found them, and that was that. I don't know what happened to the man. Our parents refused to tell us, but I'm just glad he's gone from our lives, and we'll never have to see him again. I work night shifts at an airport, cleaning planes for different airlines. I recently got the pass to start cleaning for a second airline. I never had any issues until I started working on these two planes. I clean the same group of planes every night, as they stay at my airport overnight. Well, while working on one of these two planes for Airline 2, I noticed someone walk down the aisle behind me. I thought it was my co-workers leaving me to clean the plane alone. But when I looked around, my co-workers were on the opposite end of the plane still working. This happens every night I work, pretty much. I see people walk behind me, or hear footsteps, and when I look around, there's no one there. Not really a big deal, but it's all I got. Seeing as I don't believe in ghosts, but it's something that's been bothering me. So next time you're on a plane, be careful. It might be haunted. From the time I was born, through around the time I was 14 years old. I lived in the country. The summer of 2011, my family moved into a house that was downtown in the city. Needless to say, I was stoked. We had experienced some paranormal type stuff in the house, so the family was already a little nervous about the new place. A neighbor had also told us that he thinks the lady that lived in our house before us had ended her husband's life, but we shrugged it off and thought that he was joking. Fast forward about a week, and my grandfather was outside messing around in the garage. I could hear him talking to somebody outside. As I looked out the window to see it was a woman in her early 40s talking to my grandfather. I see him shaking his head, and she seemed super sad. She then fell to her knees and was practically sobbing to him. I felt super uneasy, but didn't want to place myself within the awkward situation. After she left, I asked what she wanted, and to my surprise, he told me that she was the previous homeowner and wanted to come into the house to specifically check the fireplace and attic. I thought quickly about what the neighbor had told us. Maybe this lady had killed her husband and hidden him in one of those places. I know it seems like a movie thing to do, but why else would they only care about those things? Maybe she'd hidden money and stashed it there. Another few weeks passed, and my sister was home alone. She was constantly out and about, so she hadn't heard about the previous owner. When she was about to get into the shower, she heard someone trying to open the front door. Fortunately, it was locked. My sister said she'd seen the lady run around the house and begin banging on all the doors and windows, begging to be let in. My sister called my mother, terrified, so we both drove home quickly, but the woman was gone. My mother called the police, but they said that they really couldn't do anything about it since she had left. At this point, I was scared. I'd watched so many horror films that I knew it couldn't end well. Things began to stop happening around a year and a half. A friend of mine moved in with us, and one day we were outside playing basketball. An SUV pulled up next to our driveway, and when the window was rolled down, it was in fact the crazy lady. She looked like she had fixed herself up and was now somewhat attractive. She began flirting with me and my friend, calling us cute and winking, but I knew what she was doing. She asked if I'd take her into the house, and I said no, but she persisted. Luckily, my mother came out and began speaking to the woman. The lady started crying and begging to be let into the house because she desperately needed to see the fireplace and attic. My mother continued to say no, but the lady wouldn't leave. This part now may seem a little harsh, but I didn't really know what else to do. At the time, I was just getting into making films, and I had very real-looking prop guns in the house. At this point, my mom and the lady began, not really fighting, but it seemed like a conversation that would result in a fight. I took one of the prop guns outside, which was very stupid, and put it in my pants in front of the lady. As I figured, the lady said a few last words to my mother and drove off quickly, and after that, we had never seen her again. Whenever we were finally able to speak to the neighbor that told us the previous owner ended her husband's life, he practically said, "I told you so," and told us that he thought we should rip the fireplace apart and check the attic. We decided not to. We lived in that house for close to 8 years and just recently moved back to the country. There's been odd stuff happening at our new house, but I'm glad we're far away from that crazy lady, and I really hope to not meet her again. This happened to me a number of years ago. An altercation between my parents and I left me without a home. Don't worry, we're cool now. It was all my fault. definitely shouldn't have brought those drugs into the house, but being a stupid 18-year-old with no money, I was desperate. However, being kicked out of the house put me towards the straight and narrow. I had to find a job, as at the time, I was just sitting at home playing Xbox for most of the day, to the point that my parents' frustration grew immensely. This is why this story happened in the first place. I needed to get a job, and a friend of mine worked at a local movie theater and told me that they always needed staff. Their turnover was something insane. So I got in touch, and within 3 days he was giving me an interview. I show up, and he smirks at me, and we both just laugh in the interview room. He asks me some generic chilled out questions, and at the end says, "Yeah, Brian, you got the job." It was more the formality than anything. And by the end of the week, I have my uniform and my rota, and I'm going to be paid eventually. I actually moved in with him for a few weeks just to get off my feet, and we were having the best of times at the movie theater. There's not that much work to do, to be honest. It was a small town, and the movie theater was the only one in town. So it was popular during the weekends, but during the weekdays, there wouldn't be much going on, especially not during the day. Now, this movie theater was old. Really, really old. I want to say about 1910 or something like that. Point being, we had this dark and eerie basement at the bottom that housed all sorts of old things. It was creepy, and it had those lights that take ages to turn on. I used to call them the stagger lights. We go down the stairs to the basement every once in a while to store old movie posters, cardboard cutouts and things like that might be helpful in future or that we may use as giveaways and prizes to keep sales in the theater and have people come back. We're good like that. Don't just throw them all away. In any case, our trips down to the basement were frequent enough to make me afraid of it. It was dark, a little bit damp, and smelled. It always had this strange sensation, like I was being watched in the dark. To explain, it was a very big, dark room, right underneath one of the main theaters, with huge supporting pillars. It looked like a car park nearly. It was that big. At the edge, there was a small booth with a glass window. I still have no idea what was supposed to be there. Was that security? In any case, we didn't actually have security. Point being, this was just a very creepy place. Lots of old things, old boxes, and stuff that people had for the most part forgotten. After a few months of working there, I had gotten into the routine. I was actually quite a good worker, and me and my friends got along excellently, and the theatre was doing great business-wise. It was on one of these days where I didn't have much to do that my boss comes up to me and asks if I'd like to do a bit of overtime. Me, being young and hungry for money, asked him exactly what this entails, and he leads me down the stairs to the basement when I get a pang in my stomach. Oh no. He tells me that he wants me to organize and dispose of whatever we don't need here. That I need to make a list of everything we have, organize it so that he can go through the list and let me know what is to be kept and what is not. And once that's done, for us to then organize what's left. He said he wasn't sure how long this whole thing would take, but that he would like me to stay overtime or before my shift started, whichever was convenient for me, and try and do as many hours as it took to sort this out. The pay for doing this task was quite good, and the fact that he hadn't told me how many hours it would take meant that I could go as fast or as slow as I wanted to, which is nice because it was such a chilled environment. So I started early one Friday afternoon, got into the theatre around 8, and being the only person in there, went down to the basement. I started looking through the boxes. Loads of old random stuff. Magazines from the town that we were featured in, old posters, old merchandise, loads of things. I even found a really old projector, and I wondered if I could take it home if no one wanted it, or if it still worked. As I was going through the stuff, minding my own business, do I hear something from behind me? It was coming towards that funky little booth in the corner that I still didn't know what it was. I wondered if it could be a rat. I hate rodents of any kind, and didn't have anything to protect myself, so I grabbed the nearby broom and started quietly making my way over, seeing if I heard the noise any sooner. Just as I was about to reach that booth, do I hear a noise again, and I jump. It sounded like cans. Cans being stepped on or moved around. My head was hidden behind a pillar. As I composed myself, I moved over and peeked around the pillar. There was a pair of feet hanging outside the booth on the floor. I crept as quietly as possible to see who on earth is there. Was this one of my friends playing a prank on me? As I got closer, I saw the face of a disheveled-looking homeless man. He was asleep. He was twisting, and all around him were beer cans, monster cans, old food, packets of Snickers and stuff. My eyes opened wide as I realized that this guy was not supposed to be here, and quietly made my way out of there while running as fast as I could. When I reached the top, I called my manager, who I actually woke, and asked him if he knew that there was a homeless guy in the basement. He immediately sobered up from his sleep and told me to call the cops immediately. The cops arrived, but when they did, the man was gone. I think it was all the commotion. That's when we realized that at the back of the little booth, there is actually a secret hole that leads to one of the theaters towards the back, and then you can just go out one of the fire exits. It was incredibly weird and disturbing. My manager said he understood if I didn't want the task, but as I really needed the money, I told him to give me a week to get over it and that I'd do it anyway. It took a whole 3 weeks in order to complete the task, but the basement was looking good again, and we made sure to seal off this hidden basement door. We removed the booth, and everything was fine. I quit shortly after though, finding a better job in another town, one with a career, and tried to make something of myself. I am glad that these events happened, as it put me on the right path. But to the homeless man hiding out in the basement of the movie theater, let's never meet again. All of this happened before my parents' divorce. We were all living in a 2-story house with an attic and a basement. It was a normal house for a family of 5. My parents, myself, and my 2 siblings. At night, my parents were sleeping on the 1st floor, and me and my siblings on the 2nd. I always felt really uncomfortable in this house, especially when I was upstairs. I don't really know why, but I felt really anxious and nervous, and my brother was also feeling the same. Some stuff happened to the 2 of us. He heard some voices calling him, and even a knock in the attic. When I was alone in the house, and I was in my bedroom, I would hear as if someone were moving the chairs in the living room, and recently, my sister confessed she had heard the same thing. Even if it was scary, we were used to it, and would try and find rational explanations to these sounds. However, there is one event that my brothers and I still cannot explain. It happened about 6 years ago. It was around 3 a.m., and I remember that I was feeling quite anxious for no reason. That's why I decided to text one of my friends instead of trying to sleep. My sister used to sleepwalk. It stopped after we moved, and this night, as she usually did, she went out of her bed, walked a bit into the hall, and went back to her room. The walls were very thin, so I heard her when she closed her door and went back into bed, and that was it. She didn't move again. But after that, someone was still walking in the hall. I first thought it was my brother, that I didn't hear him go out of his bedroom, but as I was about to check on him, it stopped, and that's when I heard someone scratching at my door. I still remember the noise. It was slow and loud, and lasted for about a minute. I was too scared to go out. I tried to convince myself it was my brother, but about 5 to 10 minutes after the scratching noise stopped, I heard him leave his bedroom to go to the bathroom, and then return to sleep, and didn't stir again. At this point I was really confused and afraid. I just couldn't go out of my bedroom anymore. I never checked who or what was behind the door. At some point, I fell asleep, only because I was so exhausted. My bedside lamp was still on. I don't know how much sleep I got, but I awoke during the night and my lamp was off. I thought the light bulb had burnt out, but no, someone had switched it off. In the morning, as soon as I went downstairs, my brother came to me and asked if I had heard the noises in the hall during the night, if I heard the footsteps, and if I heard a voice. I told him that I had, except for the voice, and that's when he told me that after he went back to bed, he heard someone whisper his name, but loud enough to wake him, and that's when he saw his door half open, even though he was sure he had closed it. I also asked for the switch, but everyone just looked at me as if I was crazy and told me that no one went inside my room during the night. When my parents got divorced, we moved into another house with my mum, and now I go to my dad's only every 2 weeks for the weekend. But since we moved, I feel less anxious when I'm at his house, and nothing else happened. The thing is, I still don't understand. Why did my sister never experience anything? Why did it suddenly stop? And obviously, what or who was behind my door that night? I'd like to begin by saying that there have been many happenings in this house, but I will share the most frightening. The area where my house is was once open prairie, and we have found Native American artifacts laying around the area. When my parents divorced when I was a young teenager, my mother and I moved into this house. Now at first it seemed great. There was plenty of space, and it had a very cozy feel to it. However, as time went on, strange things began to happen. The more I noticed them, the more frequent they would become. I'd hear some walking downstairs as I was brushing my teeth, and would assume it was my mother, but whenever I checked, no one would be there. Footsteps began to be a very common sound in my house, especially at night. So after some time, I came to the realization that, oh crap, my house is haunted. Now here's where things get really weird. One day, my good friend and I had just gotten done from being out in the sun and decided to retreat to my mum's house. Considering she had been away on business, we figured this would be awesome. My friend and I could go drink or do whatever mischievous activities we wanted to. We were wrong. We walked inside and headed straight for the basement, where it was cooler than the rest of the house. While walking down the stairs, I noticed that the Beatles' Yellow Submarine poster that was hanging on the bottom of the stairwell was tilted slightly to the left. No bother, I figured. It must have gotten bumped by me or something. I fixed it, and we walked into the main room. Mind you, we had pictures and posters hanging everywhere in the basement. What my friend and I saw creeped us out. All 10 to 15 pictures on these walls were each tilted slightly to the left, just as the Beatles once had been. But the weirdness of the situation didn't stop there. The storage room, which was essentially a dirt-floored room that was lifted about 4 feet off the ground, had its door cracked open. So I walked over to see a golden glow emanating out of it. There's a pull cord light located about 10 feet from the door that's turned on. I hop up and into the storage room, crawl on my hands and knees to turn the light off, hoping that all of this had a natural explanation. I called my mum and asked her about it, and she said she has no idea what I'm talking about and hasn't been to the basement for weeks, and to leave her on her trip. Shivers shoot down my spine. I look back into the storage room, and in the dirt there's a footprint. The most distorted and mangled footprint imaginable. I'm frozen in fear. My friend is too. Without the words, we look at one another, each feeling a sickening, gut-wrenching feeling. I slammed the storage space shut, locked it, and we bolted out of my house as fast as we could. I'll never forget how sickening and mangled that footprint was, and thinking that I had crawled in there to turn the light off still gives me shivers to this day. I am a woman from California. I am not a traveller. I can't drive more than a few hours before my legs cramp up. And the train? I'm terrified. Flying-wise, I've been on a plane a few times to Ohio, and the last time we flew back home, they cancelled the flight, and it was during Hurricane Fran when my son was 7. Fast forward to several years, and my son is in boot camp in Kentucky. We are invited to share his graduation from boot camp, and did I mention it's in Kentucky? My husband and I decided to fly back for our only child's graduation from boot camp, and I was really looking forward to seeing all the things he had been doing, so we booked a flight. The flight was beautiful. I was still nervous, but seeing my son graduate was worth a few butterflies in my stomach. He took us through Fort Knox, the army base, not the gold storage building, and we got to see where he had his various exercises. We had a wonderful visit, although because I am a native Californian, Kentucky was quite a culture shock. We toured Killian and saw some interesting things around the state. My favourite part was going into Subway, the sandwich place, and asking for avocado on my sandwich, and them giving me a very confused look and asking, "What's avocado?" The graduation was beautiful, and all of the young soldiers looked so handsome. We flew home, which was very nice, and I was beginning to think that I could be a flyer. My son was sent to Fort Hood for his AIT training. That's training for his specific job. He was a tanker, and he loved Fort Hood. They had a graduation that my husband and I flew back for, and the flight went off without a hitch. We toured a small part of Texas around the base and saw some interesting sights. At least they knew what an avocado was. And when my son's time for our visit was up, we had to fly back home. I was actually looking forward to the flight home, and I was just slightly apprehensive. We said our goodbyes, and we were on our way to the airport. We boarded a nice big jet, and our flight took us from Fort Hood in Texas right past Ontario, where we needed to go, and straight to LAX, smack dab in the middle of Los Angeles, which is one city I have an extreme fear of. Our flight from Texas to LAX was uneventful and nice. Wow, I'm a flyer. I can travel and go anywhere. This is very exciting for me because I haven't been able to do much because of my fears. And now it changes. Or does it? LAX was the usual chaotic place, but we arrived on time and without incident. We went to check in for our next flight to Ontario, which we could drive to. Our flight to ONT was changed several times for reasons I can't remember. We finally get a flight and proceeded to the gate to wait. They finally called for boarding, and I was expecting the usual first-class passengers can board now, then rows 1 through 10, etc. They just called for all passengers can board now instead, and there was something my husband was not telling me as we began towards the doors that led to the plane. And as I was walking to said door, I looked onto the tarmac and didn't see the elevated platform that they used to walk us to the big jets. We were going straight onto the tarmac. I stopped at the door to outside, and my legs decided they did not want to walk any longer, and I grabbed the door frame in order not to fall. I looked like a stubborn child holding onto this door frame, so as not to go to the bathroom to take a bath. Now picture an overweight, exhausted woman doing the same thing but at an airport. The people inside looked like dominoes all running into each other, so my husband just pushed. As my husband pushes me out onto the tarmac, and all the way up the stairs leading to this little propeller plane that maybe held 10 to 20 people. As I'm pushed all the way up the stairs, every step feels like I'm walking through water. We get to the top, and I'm being led to my seat by a flight attendant. I can't move. The flight attendant looks at me and says, "Come on," as my husband pushes me, and I decide to sit in the first seat I see, which is right next to a gentleman that I can't remember. He graciously gives up his seat to my speechless husband so that he can sit next to me, which turns out was fortunate for him that he moved. I can't breathe, I can't talk, I can't even swallow any water from the water bottle that my husband magically pulls out of his backpack before putting the backpack somewhere I can't remember. As we take off, the flight attendant buckles into a seat facing the passengers and looks calm, so I don't worry. When we boarded the plane, I noticed it was slightly windy, which I wasn't worried about. As we take off, I lose it. As it's so windy, we have to fly out in the opposite direction of the wind, which is towards the ocean. My biggest fear is flying over water. As soon as the plane turns around over the water, it's just over there long enough for me to lose control. As we ascend, I notice a slight bouncing feeling, and it gets much worse. We hit cruising altitude, and it feels like a ping-pong ball in a dryer. As I'm holding my water bottle, still unable to drink any, we bounce all over the sky. My husband keeps telling me to calm down, and that it's a smooth flight and that we're almost there. The flight attendant never even left her seat, and kept her eyes on me as we fly. I tried to hold my breath, but that only lasts so long. I look out the window and I'm shaking so badly that my husband closes the window screen. I was sure the plane was going to crash, and I picture the news coverage. A passenger plane was brought down due to the Santa Ana winds, news at 11. We are landing, and I can't breathe, and I'm sure it's the end. Why couldn't I perish before we got on the plane? We land in Ontario, and that was that. I was ruined. As my feet hit the tarmac, I told my husband that I would never fly again, and that if he tried to get me on a plane, I'd wring his neck. My son is no longer in the army, and is graduating from college this weekend, and thankfully it's local. My husband decided that next year we might take a cruise. It leaves from Washington, so I'd better start walking now. The scary part is that it's a 7-day cruise to Alaska. I get severely seasick, and we're going to be on a boat in the middle of the ocean for 7 days. I get sick on the Balboa ferry, which is a 300-foot journey. Sometimes I think my husband doesn't want me around anymore. Some stuff happened to me, but most of this happened to my brother. Really, the most that happened to me was that if I left the basement, like watching television to grab a snack, I would return and certain things would be out of place. For example, television remotes, dishes that would be left down there. Sometimes the remotes were 10 feet away from where they should be. And every time I'd go to my family to see if they had tampered with anything, the answer would always be no. Sometimes I would hear my name being called out, but dismissed that easily, because I could have been hearing things. I didn't worry about this all too much, because there were no worries behind it. I was always just dismissing it. Now here was where all the freaky stuff begins. My brother always told me stories of him hearing things, like his voice being called by my parents at 3 a.m. The two biggest events that happened to him were one when he was sitting playing video games in his room in the basement, and there's a sort of hallway/pool room that is before you enter his. While he was enjoying himself, on his right shoulder, he got really cold, and he made efforts to warm it back up, but it wasn't working. And when he swiveled his chair to the right and looked into the mirror, there he was facing the door, and he saw a shadow dart in or out of his room. And then on another time, he was hearing things outside of his room. So he gets up, goes to the bathroom, comes out, and he's growling behind our pool table. We do not have dogs. He craps himself and runs into his room and locks it. Shortly after he locks it, his door handle jiggles for about 30 seconds and then stops. Weirdly though, I am not that afraid of my basement, but at night, I do not enjoy being down there alone. A friend of mine got a new house. He got a really good deal. It was about $100,000 or something. Really good for a small house. As soon as he moved in, something was off. He lived there with his girlfriend. The first encounter with the noises was when they were inside the house moving in. My friend was going up to the attic to store some extra stuff that wouldn't fit to pawn later. As he was going up the ladder, he heard a scrambling noise. He went up, and a terrible smell hit him. It was a 20-year-old house, and he thought nothing of it. After he went down, he heard something in the attic. He figured it was a rodent, and after a few weeks called an exterminator. The exterminator went up and found a bunch of coke, heroin, and every narcotic you can think of, just sitting there. He called the police and they arrived and searched the house. My friend was cuffed, the house was searched, and in the attic, they found a pipe in the corner leading to the crawl space. They didn't have a crawl space as far as they knew. The cops went back down and searched the house. They eventually found nothing, and my friend took it upon himself to break the base underneath the house. He found a living space with his stuff from the attic, and a guy with long brown hair and a torn hoodie, and my friend's extra shoes. He yelled for the cops, still out front, and got the hell out of there. The cops wanted the man to put his gun down, and he did, and they told him to get in cuffs. He walked over to the hole my friend had broke and accepted fate. He was charged with illegal drug trafficking and sentenced to a year in prison. It still creeps out my friend, even though he moved the hell away from there a few months ago, to know that some drug dealer was hiding in his house for months with a gun. My wife works as an air hostess, and this story was relayed to me from her after one of her more eventful flights. As many of you probably know, turbulence is an ordinary part of the flying experience, and air hosts are trained to know that it is not dangerous in most cases. A woman boards the plane with my wife. She could already tell that this lady was irritable, or at the very least, not comfortable flying. It was only a 4-hour flight, and my wife makes a mental note to try and be extra nice to her when interacting. The moment that the flight takes off, the woman is hammering at the little button on the airplane, trying to get the air hostess's attention. So, my wife, once the plane is in a safe position in the sky, goes over and starts speaking to her. The woman has really red eyes, and my wife instantly thinks that she's taken some kind of substance, but is unsure what. She starts looking up at my wife, stroking her arm gently, and saying, "Dearie, you need to get me off this thing. I think I'm gonna lose my mind." And then, without provocation, does she start shaking in her seat, her arms and legs flailing, smacking the seat in front, and shouting very loudly. This upsets numerous passengers, especially those next to her, and she carries on going with her fit. After a few minutes of my wife trying to calm her down, offering her water and such, does she finally stop, and my wife has to move her to first class to get her away from the other passengers. She sits there and does the same thing. At least this time, there was no one around to be bothered, at least not directly next to her. My wife is then tasked by the head stewardess to look after her for the entirety of the flight because she was being so chaotic. This went on every few minutes. My wife says it was horrifying to watch. She wanted to call an ambulance when they were arriving, but the woman said that it was normal for her to have episodes on flights as she is so afraid of the sky. Well, it was an interesting experience to say the least. When I was a dumb kid, my brother and I were playing around on the stairs. I was at the top jumping around in a pillowcase. I slipped, obviously, and went tumbling down backwards. Everything went into slow motion, as things sometimes do when your life is in peril. As I was flipping over and over, the back of my skull getting closer by the second to smashing into the hard concrete basement floor, I notice a movement coming from the dark basement. Suddenly, a large bag of dog food flies across the room as if hurled by an invisible hand with absurd precision, and interposed itself between my head and the floor. My skull smashes into the bag a millisecond later, spraying kibble instead of skull fragments around the room. My brother and I were both slack-jawed and confused. The flying bag had traveled at least 10 feet, likely saving me from death or serious injury. I used to think this was evidence for God or angels, or that I have some kind of purpose, but I realize this is evidence for nothing in particular, except that life is bizarre and unexpected things can and do happen. When I was 7 or 8 years old, my brothers and I, along with some other kids from the neighborhood, were playing our own version of hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I had to go inside the house to cover my eyes and count to 100. Nobody could see me in there while they were hiding, so I decided to cheat. I went upstairs and started looking out the window to see where everyone was hiding. When I got into my older brother's room, I looked out the window. I had just got done counting to 100, so I had to get back downstairs fast. I looked out the window really quick and then turned around to head out. Above the door I saw a little flash of light. Then the door slammed shut. I immediately looked over at the attic door that was in that room. I heard something moving in there, so I backed up as far away from the door as I could get. With my back against the wall, feeling trapped there, I heard a loud growl come from inside the attic. I tried to scream, but I was so scared that I couldn't. I just stood there motionless, waiting for whatever it was to get me. Within seconds, my brother opened the door and began yelling at me for being in his room. I ran right past him and straight out. I didn't tell anyone what had just happened. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. I had my Nintendo Wii down in the basement for the longest time and would spend hours down there. I was playing one night and all of a sudden the TV and Wii turned off. I went to check the plug because it was loose sometimes and can theoretically fall out if pulled. I wasn't pulling it to turn it off though, as I was gaming and not near the cords. I looked up from the cords as I was fixing it and saw a light grey mist in the air. I looked at it for a few seconds and then ran upstairs like the floor was on fire, and didn't go there for a while again. I have thought over it now that I'm older, and can't really see how a mist could just appear there. No leaking pipes to create moisture, no one in the house that smokes anything. The only person who smoked in my family was my grandfather, who had been deceased for a while at that point. I did have his pilot's vest hanging nearby at the time though. I live in an old house, originally built in 1919, but has had 2 additions built on. To give context, in the main level there's the living room, kitchen, bathroom, office and bedroom, with a laundry room in the basement. The office used to be a bedroom, but we put stairs into the attic in that room. The areas that are the attic, bedroom and living room are the original 1919 portions of the house. I have always had a weird vibe in that place. My husband and I bought it in spring of 2006, did a lot of renovations and moved in that fall. The attic bedroom was started in 2009 and finished in 2012. The house has always made noises, but old houses do, so not too strange. But recently, I have heard what sounds like running or falling down sounds coming from the attic room. I am a night owl and stayed up until 2 or 3 a.m. on most weekends. Last Saturday, I was in my living room reading when I heard a crashing noise from my bedroom. I ran up the stairs and my husband was sound asleep in bed. I looked around, went back downstairs, checked on my kids in their room, and both were asleep. I sat down and started reading again. About 20 minutes later, it sounded like someone jumped 3 times in the attic room directly above me. I ran up again. Same thing. Everyone was asleep. No one had moved. After this, I went back to the living room, grabbed my phone, and just went to bed. I didn't have any scared feelings, just felt curious. I casually mentioned it to my husband Sunday morning, and one of my daughters heard me. We all commented that it was strange. Today my daughter told me she heard it in the morning as she was getting ready for school. I think there's something up there in the attic. Almost every night, I like to go into my basement for a night of playing video games with my friends. Normally the night goes well and I'm in bed by 1, but recently I have been hearing sounds in my basement, such as what I believe to be coughing and sometimes snoring. When I hear this, I immediately go up to my room and sleep until the morning. When I go back down to my computer, I am sometimes greeted with odd websites that I have never visited, and my initial thought was that I had a virus. I did a virus scan and found nothing. When this happened again 3 times over the course of 2 weeks, I completely wiped my hard drive of everything, and when I woke up in the morning, Google Chrome had been installed to my computer, and 30 tabs were open to various websites. But the strangest one was the FedEx website, telling me my package had been shipped. I didn't look where, but I regret it now. Almost 3 months had gone by, and I hadn't thought much about the situation other than the odd sounds, and I asked my friend to go into the basement to get something for me. I was surprised when he ran up the stairs as fast as he could, and what he said he saw next was enough to prompt me to call the police. He said he saw someone crawling out of the window well by the time he got down there, and all he saw was that person's legs. We ran outside to look for them, but there were no signs of them anywhere. We both assumed that they had gone into the woods about 50 feet from my house. When the police came, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The police left and my friend left 15 minutes later, understandably frightened by what he had just seen. For the next 2 months, I still heard these sounds and experienced scary and strange occurrences, like my downstairs shower being wet when nobody had used it beforehand. And one day, they all stopped, and I had a note on my desk written in Sharpie that said thanks for the stay. And that was the end of the situation. For the longest time, I thought the note was part of an elaborate prank. But now, I'm not so sure. With all the other stuff that's happened between all of that, and the fact that my family had all been asleep during these encounters to this day, I still have no idea who that person is, and don't really care to find out. So I have this story. A lady brought her service animal on board. Turns out it was just a pet she had brought a vest for. This dog was completely out of control. He was jumping all over us in the row, barking, growling, snapping at people, and running all over the place. The flight attendant told her she would need to keep the dog in the carrier, and the lady turned into a witch, saying that she had no right to tell her to put her service dog away. Mid-flight, the dog took a dump right on the aisle floor, and it reeked so bad. Her dog had crawled up in my face, and its long nails scratched me through my shirt so hard that I began bleeding. After I got off the plane, I met up with my family and they said, "Oh my God, you smell like a wet dog." And I had to tell them this story of this awful lady and her service dog. Sometimes I hear a piano playing in my room. It's not coming from my TV or anywhere else in my house. I don't own a piano or anything like it. It sounds like it's coming from every direction at once, like I can't pinpoint it, but sometimes it leans to the corner of my attic. I've recorded it once, and once a friend started crying after listening to it. Both friends I showed it to said the tune was familiar, and they had played something similar to it before. I also have a mirror in my room. It's just a normal mirror, but when my friends look into it, they usually get really emotional and remember traumatic things. Last time I had both of my friends over, which was just last Friday. One of them was making light of it all and poked at the mirror, and after that it got kind of scary. It felt like something was with us. I felt a hand grab onto my arm, and when I looked at it, saw a small handprint, yet no one was there. One of my friends got scratched on the cheek. The piano music started playing again very loudly, and everyone in the room heard it clearly. We decided to try the Snapchat thing, with the ghost face being picked up by the lens, and I felt something grab onto my shoulder, like a kid hiding behind me when I moved it to pick up a face behind me. I was so scared and I screamed. We were all frozen in place for a while, and I began to get irrationally angry at one of the two friends, the one who had been messing with the mirror beforehand. What's so terrifying about this entire thing is this happened one day after rearranging my room, and it's still just as bad when I'm alone now. When we were moving it around, my sister found a cross charm and took it out of the room, so perhaps it's correlated. I actually got the cross back from her on Sunday and put it on the dresser with a weight on it. I just got home after nobody was here all day, and it disappeared. I'm scared. I feel like I'm constantly being watched and seeing things out of the corner of my eye. The one and only paranormal thing that has ever happened to me was when I was around 14 years old, sitting on my couch in my basement alone watching TV. With no warning, I start hearing the slow humming noise directly to my left, inches away, and every hair on my left side stands on end. I don't know how, but I had the balls to stand up, walk, and turn off the TV without a remote, and walk up the stairs. All the while I'm about to OD on adrenaline. Nothing but a noise and a feeling, but I vividly remember repeating in my head, something is right next to me. I never had another incident after that one. I was flying home from Aruba on a family vacation as a kid. It was a fairly smooth flight on a 747. All of a sudden, we heard the engine spin up big time, and the plane dives, like super steep dives, and you can hear and feel the acceleration. Naturally, people are screaming and freaking the hell out, and after no more of 10 to 20 seconds, but that actually felt endless, we level off and the engines decelerate. Then the pilot comes up on the intercom with something along the lines of, "Sorry about that, folks, there was an inbound other country 747 on the same altitude as us, and we couldn't get communication confirmation, so we had to execute an emergency dive to prevent a collision." Fun times. There was one time around 2011 when I was 17 and we rented a house with my parents and grandparents in Corsica, which is an island south of France, for a week to enjoy a summer vacation. It was a one-story house with a sort of attic, a bit old school judging by the decorating, but overall really nice, with a lovely view on the nearby beach. My room was in the attic, which was all good, carpeted with a bit of furniture and a small window, and you had to climb a ladder and go through a trap door in the pantry to get to it. Sounds a bit weird when you say it, but it was a sweet place, and as a teen I enjoyed the privacy. The first night I didn't sleep well. I had nightmares which I couldn't remember and was overall agitated, and woke up more tired than before. I brushed it off as coming from the heat or the general setting of the place. Nothing really out of the ordinary, even if I'm usually a fairly sound sleeper. The second night, I had been sleepwalking. I woke up down in the pantry, my heart beating like crazy with no idea why I was out of bed. It happened once or twice before, and a few more times since, but that wasn't really common for me. A bit unsettled, I went back to bed and had trouble to sleep again. But the next morning, I hardly had any memory of it and brushed it off once more. The third night was too much. I felt like I hadn't slept at all, even if I must have, as I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep for a while. I had that weird feeling that someone was watching me. I checked the window for no real reason, as it was too high for anybody to be there, then closed the trapdoor going down to the pantry. I actually locked myself in. As I went back to bed, the feeling persisted, and when I looked around, I had the certitude that someone was in the room, watching from somewhere in the dark. I remember turning the lights on and finding nothing. Since I was pretty scared at that point, I left the lights on and probably eventually fell asleep. I woke up sometime later in complete darkness, and someone was at the end of my bed. A silhouette watching. I completely lost it. I started to breathe heavily, and with my eyes wide open I saw more silhouettes emerging from the dark corners of the room, getting closer. I couldn't take my eyes off them, feeling like if I did, they would grab me. I couldn't move either. I couldn't decide what I should do. Scream at them? Call for help? Run for it? I eventually went for the trap door, struggled to open it, and fell my way down the pantry, closing the door after me, and made it to the living room. I was standing there half naked and completely freaking out, trying to figure out what to do. I could wake up my parents, but to tell them what? That some creatures were in my room? That wouldn't do. I checked the doors and windows were locked as usual, so no one else would be there. I ended up on the couch and fell asleep there as dawn broke slowly. My family found me in the morning, and after that, I told my parents I wouldn't sleep alone anymore. Aged 16 or so, I'd rather sleep on the floor at the end of their bed than up there in the attic again. They never questioned it, figuring that something happened, and I could swear on my life that I was wide awake. I kept telling myself that because it felt like it. I've never been more scared in my life. I'm not sure I can stress that enough. I told a few people about it who said that it must have been sleep paralysis. But was it? It was so real and vivid, and has never happened anywhere else. And I wasn't feeling stuck in the bed or as if someone was on my chest, which is what I've heard from other people. This place was weird. This room was weird. I didn't get back up there for the whole stay. My parents had to go up and collect my things. I never figured this one out, and never had such an intense and vivid thing happen again. My sister had a sleepover with her friend this weekend. They were both down in the basement because the rec room was there. It's a pretty cozy room with an old Xbox, an easel for painting, some armchairs and comics. My sister and her friend often play around there by themselves, painting, playing Minecraft, usual 13-year-old stuff. We're used to them being alone down there, and our basement isn't seen as creepy or unsettling in any way. On Friday night, however, our evening got interrupted by the girls scrambling up the stairs, shrieking like a couple of bats out of hell. "There's something in the basement," my sister screamed. We figured they'd gotten spooked by a spider or something like that, so my parents went down to investigate. The basement was found empty. The girls were asked what all the fuss was about, and they told my parents the door handle to the basement began rattling so hard the entire door started shaking. I later asked my sister what all the yelling was about, and she showed me what had happened. It was like someone was trying to rip the door off, she told me, while grabbing the door handle and yanking it like someone trapped. It couldn't have been a draft, as the bathroom isn't connected to any of the outside walls, nor does it have any windows. They were laughing and giggling like crazy from the excitement of getting spooked like that, and we left it at being a weird but harmless occurrence. It did, however, remind me of something that I remember happening to me when I was a kid in that same basement. I must have been 8 years old, because I had gotten my own keys and was allowed to walk home on my own. I knew my parents were at work, so I unlocked the door and stepped inside. As I did, I looked at the basement door, and as I stepped in, I saw the door handle start to rattle and the door opening. I got so scared I bolted out of the house straight over to my friend's house, bawling my eyes out the entire way. Once my parents came home and I told them what happened, they explained what a cross draft was and how that's the most likely explanation for what caused the door to open. I believed it back then, but after this weekend, I'm not so certain. I was flying from Vegas to Stockton. Mistake number 1, Stockton. And right at takeoff, the plane started shaking violently. I admit this can be normal, but the pilot somehow turned on the intercom and was shouting, "Whoa, whoa," like he was terrified, which in turn made me terrified. I literally started to cry. I thought this was the end. For the first time in my life, I had never until that moment actually felt like I could perish. They turned off the intercom pretty quickly, and after the longest minute of my life, the plane stopped shaking and I silently wept for the rest of the 30-minute flight. They never addressed what happened. They never reassured anyone. They just pretended like it didn't happen. Now, I am no novice to air travel. I have flown all over the world and have even felt a little jittery about flying in the past. But I can honestly say that I don't know if I can ever be so casual about flying again. Unexplained things have happened to me all my life, and boy howdy do I have a lot of experiences to share. This all happened in my childhood home, which we sold 4 years ago in the Griffith Park area of LA. My grandparents had moved in with my mum about 6 years ago. My grandpa passed away before I was born, and my grandma didn't want to live alone, so she gave the house to my mum with the condition that she was to live in the duplex, and my mum can raise her family in the main house. It was a 2-story house built in the late 60s, with a duplex that was attached by a door, just to the left of the front door, our side of the house. The main house was big, and the duplex was small, but it was an entire apartment. This is where my grandma lived for the entirety of my childhood years. Our side of the house, or so I was told, was a holistic doctor's office a few years before my grandparents moved in. The doctor worked out of the duplex, which functioned as his waiting room and exam room, and he lived in the main house along with 2 or 3 live-in nurses that worked for him. My family decided it was best not to tell me this info until my late teens, after which I had had multiple strange things happen to me. I'd say my first experience in the house happened when my dad decided to seal off a hallway that connected the master bedroom to a smaller bedroom on the opposite side of the house. My mum wanted to make the 2 rooms separate, so my dad put walls up on either side of the hall, making closets for each room, and essentially creating a big, empty, sealed-off hallway in between. The other room was my room, but I hated it. For years before I realized I was a magnet for paranormal activity. I thought I was just full of anxiety, because sleeping in that room always filled me with fear when I was alone. I remember feeling like someone was going to come up the stairs while I was sleeping and hurt me. I often slept under the bed with a wall of pillows barricading myself in. my parents would just brush me off, chalking it up to too many scary movies with my older sisters. Being in that room always felt weird, but being near the closet, or worse yet, having my back to it, filled me with a strange urgency to get away, or face what was behind me. On the wall that was created by my dad's renovation, we hung this painting of a cat that my grandfather sent me for my birthday. One night, while I was asleep on the bed, which was my first mistake, the painting fell off the wall. I jumped up and looked into the closet just as my dad burst through the door, about to yell at me for breaking something, when he saw me standing there wide-eyed and practically hyperventilating. He looked into the closet. The painting hadn't fallen off the wall. Instead, the glass had shattered out of the frame on its own. And it didn't just shatter, it exploded. There was glass all the way to the door of the closet, which was about 5 feet deep. He told me it was just the temperature of the house changing so drastically that it shattered the glass. We cleaned it up as best we could at 2 a.m. and went back to sleep. Needless to say, I stayed up until sunrise and slept in the living room once the house was awake and I had people around me. After that, late at night, I would often hear someone walking around downstairs, but never said anything because I always thought it was my dad who had bad insomnia. A few years later, when both my sisters had moved out and my brother took the good room with the balcony, I moved into his old room directly across from our parents' room. This room had a huge floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelf and a little closet with a 4x4 square hatch to go up into the attic inside. Yeah, that little square hatch and I were not cool. I was around 13 when I moved into this room, and the closet most definitely turned into nightmare fuel. My dad had removed the door because he figured out my magic trick to lean my room and replace the door with an old sheet on a curtain rod. I would often come home from school or wherever, and the attic hatch would be open. Not wide open, but the piece of wood that laid over the hatch would have been slid over about half an inch. My family is very matter-of-fact and stoic, so there's no way they were trying to prank me. Because 1, I never told anyone about my fear of the attic, and 2, we never did any of that stuff. As much as I wanted to be that close, this didn't stop me from asking though. I made sure that it was no one in my family, and this persisted for 2 years. Here's where I lost it. This is the point where I had had enough. I was standing in front of said closet with my dog, Duke. He was a very protective Springer Spaniel that I got for my 9th birthday. My back was to the closet door, or curtain, and I was petting Duke, and I felt something brush the back of my leg, and looked down to my ankle. It was the curtain moving back, as if there was a strong breeze. Duke whined, and I felt a hand on the back of my leg through the curtain. It felt like my leg was pushed forward. So with that momentum I took a step and ran. I ran through the house with my dog at my heels, crying and shouting for my dad. Dad didn't help much. He set me down and told me his paranormal experiences in the house. He had seen one of the nurses walking through the house at 2 a.m. when he was sitting in the kitchen reading. He looked up from his book to contemplate something, and saw who he thought was my grandmother who needed a walker, because she had a broken hip about 6 months prior to this, standing in the doorway. She was in a long nightie and looked bewildered that I was sitting there, and kept walking past the door. He figured that maybe she needed some air or wanted to let the dogs out into the yard, as the dining room had big French doors at the opposite end, which led to the mudroom and backyard. She didn't say anything, and because he didn't see her go back inside, and because he started making some toast or something. Anyway, it was around 7 a.m. when he heard her through the wall. He went to check on her and see what she needed earlier. Maybe it had startled her and she didn't have a bra on or something, so she didn't want to speak that early. She told him that she had been sleeping since 1 a.m. and had just sat up in bed as he walked in. There's no way it was her standing there. It must have been one of the nurses that died there, and was so shocked that he was looking straight at her. So, there you have it. For context, I'm terrified of planes. In 6th grade, my school invited me and some friends for a trip to another state. The thing is, we had to go by plane. The trip was great, but the day we were supposed to return there was a giant storm going on. The plane took off, regardless. And let me tell you, kid me almost had a stroke. Not only was it shaking a lot, people weren't calm. Everyone was basically going insane and ready to give up on life. To make matters worse, for some unknown reason, we had to go back. I thought it's because we were going to perish in the storm. We returned to the airport and I phoned my family and started crying so much that I basically wanted someone to go over to that state by car to pick me up, and it's a 5-day ride. Later we found out that a piece of ice hit the pilot's window, cracking it, making us return to the airport. I was terrified, and that left a scar on my mind. Now, whenever I enter a plane, I remind myself of what happened. Thankfully, on the day after, and not being able to sleep in the hotel because I was too scared, the 2 flights we had to take went fine, and I returned home safely. I'm 16 and live with my mum in our 2-story house with a basement. Now, our basement isn't creepy or anything. It doesn't even really look like there is a basement. From the front door of the house there's a little walkway, and then a set of carpeted stairs that leads to an open door frame that in turn leads into the basement. The basement has 3 rooms in it, and a bathroom. There is my room, which is at the beginning of the hallway, and the spare room, which is right across from my room. Now, the hallway that separates our room is only maybe 100 to 200 feet long, if that, and is covered by that fake tile stuff that you can buy at hardware stores. If you walk down the hallway, you'll first come across an opening off to your right side that houses the water heater and the entry to the crawl space. It has a clothesline that goes across it to hang up any clothes that couldn't dry in the dryer. Continue walking, and maybe 20 feet later, you'll come across the bathroom, which will be on your left. At the very end of the hallway, it opens up into a bigger squared room that we call the playroom. Now that you've got the layout of the basement, onto the story. I've always felt as if there was something off about the house. I'd feel my eyes on me in my room, shadows moving in the corner of my vision, maybe hands brushing my back as I walk up my mum's room onto the uppermost floor to say good morning to her. I'd almost always brush it off, because these little things never seemed malicious to me. There have been 2 times, however, where I would feel something look at me that was more malicious. One time was last year, before we remodeled my room. We had just brought the paint, and I was getting ready to go to sleep. I turned off all the lights and climbed into bed, shutting my eyes. Something, however, compelled me to open them that night, and when I did, I saw a figure standing in the upper left-hand corner of my room glaring at me. That was the first time I felt utterly rooted to my bed by the terror that I felt and the hatred and anger oozing off whatever was by the corner of my room. But then I blinked, and suddenly there was no figure, just my old broom leaning against the corner. The maliciousness was gone, and I could feel I could breathe again. The second time was just tonight, about half hour ago. I was getting water to fill up my fish tank a little because the level had dropped. I had a pitcher that I was using to fill water up, and I had just filled it up in the bathroom down here when I turned around and there it was again. The figure, standing only about 15 feet away from the entry of the bathroom under part of the clothesline that spanned the area where the crawl space was. The anger and hatred I felt from that thing, the thing that was almost suffocating. I almost dropped the pitcher of water I was holding. I would have, if I wasn't paralyzed with fear. Within a few seconds I found my voice, and my brain managed to regain control. I screamed and stepped back. As soon as I did, the figure vanished once more. It took all I could to not run back to my room and close the door as quickly as I could. The thing was, this time I was shaking. I barely managed to dump the water into my fish tank without spilling it. I don't want to leave my room again tonight. I don't know if I'm just imagining these things, or if there is truly something in the basement that doesn't want me here. Over the course of 2 years, I've had weird dreams about a very specific creature lurking in the attic. It always felt malevolent. Now I don't know if it's an actual thing or my subconscious messing with me, but it deeply unsettled me in ways my dreams almost never do. As someone who is always aware they're dreaming, even dreams where I'm being hunted down didn't scare me, but this does. There have been so many dreams about it, but a few stick out in my head. The least threatening one was a dream where I'm playing video games in my room. I glance out of my bedroom door to see an arm dangling from the opening in the attic. The hand moves like it's beckoning me to come closer. I don't, because obviously, but I watch it. It never leaves the attic, but it keeps trying to get me to go to it. In another dream, I'm in a house that I've never been to. My sister and nieces are in this house with me, and I get the impression it's threatening my family. I'm angry, so I get vocally aggressive, and I get my family out of there and go back to confront this thing. I see it. For the first time in all the dreams I had, it looked like a woman with light purple skin and dreadlocks. I don't remember how this dream ended, but there were more dreams after, never including my family again, just me. The most intense encounter I had was a dream where the attic was right above the bed I was sleeping in. I was lying there, very aware that it was watching me. I figured if I ignored it, it would go away, but I was wrong. It slowly pulled the covers off me, and after a few minutes of lying there, cold, trying to decide if it's safe to pull the blanket up, it grabs me by the throat and lifts me about a foot off the bed and starts choking me. I felt like my lungs were going to burst when it let go and let me fall back onto the bed, gasping for breath. I don't know how many dreams I had since this one, or if it was the last, but I know it's been at least half a year since I've dreamt about it. I'm very uneasy around attics now, and I always expect to look up and see it again when I pass underneath one, awake or not. Even right now, I keep throwing glances at the attic door right outside my bedroom. Nothing's there, of course, but it's still on my mind. If this thing is not my subconscious, and it's an actual entity, I have no idea what it could be. In my limited experience with the paranormal, I've never encountered anything that felt malevolent before. My hope is that my brain just decided it wanted to be terrified of attics, or that this thing got bored with me and left forever. When I was about 4 years old, my parents and I moved into a new house in a really awesome neighborhood. Everything was going great. One night, my dad woke up to heavy knocking on our front door at 3 a.m. He went to see what was going on, and there were multiple police cars and a bunch of policemen standing around our house. My dad opened the door and asked the officers what was wrong. One of them said, "Sir, I need you to bring your wife and child if you have one downstairs. Then I need you to step outside with these officers here." My dad had no idea what in the world was happening, but he went upstairs and woke up my mum and I. When he brought us down, the officers sat my mum and me on the couch and started asking some super weird questions. Does your husband ever hurt you? Has he ever made you feel helpless? Have you ever gone into your basement to get away from him? Does he ever lay hands on you or your child? All stuff like that. My mum was shocked and of course said no to all of it. My dad would never do something like that. The policemen with flashlights and guns came in and asked to search our house. We said yes because we were honestly freaked out at this point and no one was telling us what was going on. They walked around our house and then asked to see our basement. Our basement is not finished, but it is quite large and super creepy. I hate it so much. No one ever goes down there and we keep it locked. My dad unlocked it and they searched it and were calling out stuff like, "We're here to help, please come out." They couldn't find anything of interest and came back upstairs. Then my dad told them that we deserved to know what was going on. One of them said, "Nothing seems to be the matter here, so I guess it's fine to tell you. We received a call from a woman who was in hysterics. She was screaming and crying, saying that her husband was going to finish her. She had barricaded herself in her basement to get away from him." My dad was spooked and said, "Well, why would you come to our house?" The officer said, "We traced the call to your house, and that is why I hate my basement so much more than I already did. Our neighborhood is very old and so is our house. So maybe it's a ghost or something. We still don't know what happened that night, but I do know that sometimes weird stuff happens in my basement. It has a door to the outside that we keep locked, but I've even been outside and seen it swing open. We even use stuff like deadbolts, so that's fun for us, I guess." I had a pretty bad experience while flying. It was New Zealand to Frankfurt, Germany, non-stop. It was a really long flight. I sat in the 3-seat window section with a couple. The woman gets airsick the moment she steps on the plane, so she started using the sick bags before we even shut the doors. And she did not stop for over 20 hours. I got used to smelling her bile after a while, but couldn't get used to the sound of her retching. I broke out the bottle of Jack Daniels I bought in duty free and drank until I passed out. Of course, 23 hours allows for time to sleep off a bottle of Jack and wake up hungover. And when I did wake, I look over towards the window and there was that woman with the bag still at her face. My husband and I lived in Centerville for a few years, in a ranch-style house that was built in the 1960s, which had a small-sized crawl space with no insulation, dirt, and spiderwebs. It also had a typical southern attic that is basically a small standing area of 2x4 rafters and blown insulation. The purpose is simply to store heat, both in the summer and to keep it out of the house, and in winter to keep it from leaving. There were some questionable things about this house, mostly ignorable, just quirks, like bullet holes in the reinforced makeshift metal sheets that covered the windows of the back door in the garage. Little things, features. Anywho, my husband made comments about waking up at night hearing strange loud noises coming from the attic. He said it sounded like a large wooden dresser being dragged across a hardwood floor directly above the master bedroom. Loud, heavy, obvious. My husband also said that one of our dogs, a Catahoula hound, would wake up, jump off the bed, and move to where the sounds started. At this point, his hackles would rise, shoulders lower, and his gaze would focus on the sound. He would then slowly follow the sound, silently stalking it as it made its way across the room. He would follow it directly across the bed, jumping up and walking across both my husband and I as he followed it silently. When the sound finally reached the bathroom door on the far side of the room, the dog would sit, stare upward, and slowly lower his head as if he were watching something come down from the ceiling. He would then slowly turn his gaze to the left towards a window in the bathroom. At this point, his hackles would lower, and he would gingerly return to bed. According to my husband, this happened regularly. My husband told me about this for 6 months, and for 6 months I thought he was making things up to scare me as a joke. Nope. I woke up hearing this loud scraping noise from above our bed that sounded like a heavy wooden dresser being dragged across a hardwood floor. I reached to shake my husband to wake him up, but he was already awake. He looked over and said, "Just watch the dog." So I did. An old hound dog did exactly what my husband said before. Hackles up, jumped off the bed, and followed the sound, and stopped at the door. He watched, traced the noise, and relaxed and came back to bed. My husband then said, "Told you." My dad's job requires him to go inside people's houses. He has been in thousands of apartments and homes, so I asked him what was the weirdest and creepiest thing he has ever seen or experienced. My dad arrived early to this apartment complex around 7 a.m. because he had to go through every apartment doing some maintenance starting from the basement. He entered a laundry room located in the basement, where a man was in his 50s, wearing a nice white shirt and tie, suit pants but no shoes, and he had a green tarp in his hands. He thought it was kind of weird, but just ignored it since it's not his business. Later that day, he left to a local coffee shop to spend his break, and when he came back to work, there were police cars surrounding the area. Out of curiosity, he asked one of the police officers what was going on, and it turns out a homicide was committed. Dad then asked if what he saw was related to the crime, and it was. After the police interrogation, they told him that the man without shoes stabbed his mother to death in the bathtub, wrapped her in a tarp, and dragged her outside. The police caught her dragging his dead mother in the backyard. Of course, they didn't let my dad do his job in the murderer's apartment until after a proper investigation. A while goes by and Dad gets to go there and finish what he's doing. He felt really uncomfortable doing plumbing and other maintenance in a house where someone had just been brutally finished off, especially in a bathroom, in a bathtub full of dried up blood. First of all, a little backstory. Growing up, my grandmother and I would mess around with the paranormal, doing EVPs and such. When I was 13 though, we stopped. My grandma recently started doing it again, and in return, strange stuff has been happening to me. I work in a nursing home, and I've never really experienced anything particularly paranormal. I work nights, so there is the occasional creak in the night, but nothing crazy. That was till one evening when I was emptying a cath bag, and the resident's roommate, who was in the hospital at the time, glass trinket, started to make a sound of glass clanking. I turn around and see the glass trinket fly across the room at me. I calmly walk out and recollect myself, and then go back into the room, pick the object up, and return it to where it belonged. Weeks go by, and one night at around 1 a.m. I'm sitting at the nurse's station and hear what sounds like running down the hall. I get out of my chair to look, but there's nothing. I brush it off as my head playing tricks on me, as I was suffering from some mild paranoia that night. Half-hour later, I've calmed down quite a bit, when the attic starts to creak, and it sounds like human footsteps are coming from above me. I run down to the other unit to ask if any of the maintenance men have come and are in the attic. They laugh and say no. The unit nurse tells me that stuff fell out of one of the attic doors, and one of the items was a mask that you get when you get sick. I then went to look at every attic door, as we had multiple, and they were all closed, and no ladders leading up to them. I tried to tell myself it's all in my head, but to this day I believe that there was someone up there. Then one night I was off at home sleeping, when I recall seeing shadow people walking around my room. They were looking for something. I couldn't move, but I was watching them, wondering what the hell was going on. Then, all of a sudden, I see my grandma's old house, and these shadow people were ripping up the stairs looking for seeds. Then, I was in an apartment complex stairwell, and this boy told me to give him my hand, so I did. And he cut into the top section of my finger, and inside me there were 3 little white seeds, which he took. I went back to sleep and saw the shadow people again. One of them this time touched my back, and I awoke to my back being cold, and to my surprise my shirt was raised up in the back, and my back was exposed. Did what I do when I was younger automatically connect me to what she does now? What does this all mean? I was riding on a plane home, and the woman in front of me started snoring loudly. As it was a night flight and me being a light sleeper, this was pretty annoying. But I just sat there with my headphones in, trying to fall asleep to this podcast I was listening to, when all of a sudden, my ears perk up in a moment of silence. The woman is muttering. I pause my podcast and listen to see what she's babbling about, and it goes something like this. "We had to do it, Derek. We had to. They couldn't live. We needed to throw them in the lake. They wouldn't have survived the winter anyway. I know he was my son, but he needed to go." Babbling on over and over about her son and the cold and the winter and the lake. I got a fairly good idea by the end of this that this woman had done something horrific in her past and couldn't deal with it, and it was just blubbering out because it was in her subconscious. It freaked me out a little bit, and I made note to not annoy that woman at any cost. I'm pretty sure that my basement is bigger than the house itself. With that, there is a good amount of stuff down there. The stairs are in the middle of the basement and leads to the left side of the basement. On the right side, opposite the staircase, is where the washer and dryers are. This is where my story takes place. Every time myself or my dad's girlfriend goes down there to do laundry, we get this very, very strong feeling of being watched. It's not so malicious, but it's freaky. I have a look over my shoulder every 10 seconds because I'm so sure someone is looking at me, but every time I look around, there's no one. Most times I have to bring my dog down with me so that I have some comfort. Even my female dog gets shaken up about being down there. I should note that I used to sleep in the basement of about 3 or 4 months, and I never got that feeling. I feel a bit of hate and resentment when I'm down there, but it's not strong like the feeling of being watched. It really was starting to freak me out, to the point where I can't even step foot on the concrete floor anymore. I started doing my laundry and then closed the top of the machine, and as it started I was walking away. I then heard this high-pitched scream in my ear like a little girl, like something pretended to be one. I froze for 10 seconds and bolted up the stairs, and just was at the top of the stairs ready to close the door when I heard another high-pitched scream at the bottom, and it was ascending. I have no clue what to think anymore. I'm just really scared. I've even brought my dog down with me if I have to go down there. I just can't stand it. I went to bed early today because I exercised twice and felt my body was really tired. I woke up a few times, but everything was fine. Just a normal night, as I sleep in the attic. But then I woke up at 3:30 feeling very cold and kind of ill. I grabbed another blanket and tried going to sleep again. When I almost fell asleep, I heard a little boy's voice laughing in my ear. I instantly felt paralyzed and heard him running away. I wanted to scream, but I just couldn't get anything out of my mouth. After a few seconds, I calmed down with the thoughts that it could have been my little brother doing a sick prank or something, but I knew he would never do something like that. But I needed some idea to not make me go crazy at that moment. After getting control of my body again, I turned on the lights and just sat on my bed thinking about what had happened. Maybe it was just the fact that my body was cold and exhausted, and that I almost fell asleep and started imagining things. This would not have been my first encounter with something paranormal while sleeping in the attic. I also had a period where I had a lot of sleep paralysis, but never while sleeping in the attic. To come back to the idea that my little brother tried to scare me or something, to get into the attic, you need to open a hatch and slide the stairs down, very old school. Every night before going to bed, I bring up the stairs and close this hatch. So even if it was my little brother, the noise of opening the hatch and everything would have woken me up. I also heard someone running away, and there were no places to hide. Nor would he have had enough time to go downstairs and close the hatch again, which would have made a lot of noise. When I was very young, I lived in a house which was very old. I think it must have been at least 70 years old. I loved that house so much, except for the basement. I always hated the malevolent vibe that was ever present in the air down there. It felt evil, and I don't mean that lightly. I always felt like a pair of cold eyes were watching my every move, waiting to strike. I got the worst vibe from the room at the end of the hallway. Yes, a hallway in a basement. There was a small room at the end of the hall. The air there was thick with dread. It felt like something would lunge out at me at any moment. The only time I voluntarily went into the room was when there was a tornado warning. While in that room, I vividly remember feeling an awful force from the top right corner. I never dared to look away from the corner, even to find comfort by leaning into my mum for fear of whatever was lurking down there. I only recently found out from an old neighbor who had lived in the house beside us for a very long time that the last owner hung himself in that very corner of the basement. I was shocked when I heard that. Very little else was mentioned about him. One other previous owner also did the same thing in my old closet. I remember that it used to freak me out being in there, but thinking back on it now, I never felt the same feeling of dread that I did then while I was in the basement. So maybe they didn't want to hurt us. I don't think the same can be said for the other one though. It has been at least 10 years since I was last in that house, and even if I were to go back, I would not set foot in the basement. While in the military, my unit had an exercise. We had to fly a few hours away. Apparently, my unit rented a big plane and had some Air Force pilots fly it. My assumption is those pilots never flew those big planes, so they wanted to see what it could do. When we took off, it felt like a space rocket as we went straight up. They then turned the plane like they were dodging missiles. Finally, we were on course to our destination, so I thought everything would go smoothly from that point. Nope. I fell asleep and woke up feeling like I was in freefall. I was terrified. I looked across the aisle and saw one of my officers looking back at me with that, "Oh my god, this is the end," kind of look on his face. Everyone else was still asleep. I guess these pilots decided they wanted to see how many engines they could turn off, because I began noticing the sound of engines powering on and off. Life lesson: do not allow an Air Force fighter pilot to pilot a large civilian plane. It will not be a comfortable flight. About 5 years ago, I worked doing delivery and pickup/removal of furniture and electrical appliances with a charity. I've always been skeptical about the paranormal, but love watching and reading things, and also have a few unexplained things that have happened to myself. But this one time at work creeped me out, and has made me question a lot. So it was a normal day, nothing out of the ordinary until the last job, when we went to pick up some items from a house, and as soon as I walked into the gate I had a feeling of, something's not right here. But I brushed it off as having a long day's work. So we entered the house, me and the other person, and the owner was the nicest woman you could meet, and right away made us feel welcome until she opened the door to the attic, and it was like falling into snow the way the cold hit me so unexpectedly. And I had the feeling someone watching me as I reached the top step and got the image of an old man in my head wearing an old woolen jumper and grey bottoms with slippers. He was pissed. I could feel the anger and the feeling of get out. But again I brushed it off as my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this house was haunted. And as we were removing the furniture, I kept asking my co-worker, "Dude, can you feel it? This place is haunted." To which he laughed. He was a total non-believer in the paranormal, but as we took the last item out, he made a comment to the owner as a little joke. "Big old house here, huh? There been any ghostly goings on?" To which she replied without hesitation, like she gets asked every day, "Oh yeah, all the time." To which I dropped to my side and said, "Told you." And she proceeded to tell us about some of the things that have happened. And as we laughed it off and got into the van and started driving away, I got the feeling that someone was watching us even then, even when we pulled up to a red light and waited. My co-worker checked the worksheet, and I read the newspaper, and he wasn't paying attention and missed the light turning green. But as we pulled out, a car ran the other red light and smashed into a passing car. But the car was exactly where we should have been. But my questions are, why did I know? Why did I see this old dude? And what the hell was all that about? When I was 18, I was attending university and renting a room in an old house a few blocks off campus. Only one other room in the house was rented, and the girl who lived there spent most of her time at her boyfriend's place. I basically had the entire house to myself. I would estimate that it was built sometime between 1910 and 20, based on the style and neighborhood. But I could be wrong. I do know that it was about 100 years old at the time, and the oldest home I'd ever had. It was my first time living alone. and since it was such a big empty space, I spent most of my time in my room behind a locked door. It wasn't super creepy or anything, but at night when I was alone, I tended to avoid leaving my room unless absolutely necessary. It had the same uneasy feeling of turning off the basement light and then running up the stairs as fast as you could in the dark. Not for any real reason, but it made your heart race anyway. Near the end of my first semester, I contracted influenza A. I'd been pretty fortunate with my physical health up until then, and it was the sickest I'd ever been in my life. I could barely peel myself out of bed to go to the bathroom or to feed myself. I was incredibly weak, my whole body ached, and I was running a very high fever. I actually developed arthritis in my joints as a symptom, which I didn't even know was possible. I remember waking up with a puddle of sweat collected in the hollow of my throat at one point. It was absolutely disgusting. A few days into the ordeal, I woke up to find an elderly man sitting by the side of my bed. There was no chair there, but he was very obviously in a seated position. For some reason, I didn't react with shock at all. I was completely unafraid. I asked him what he was doing there, and he simply said, "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I must have fallen back asleep because that's all I remember from the visit. This could have easily been a NyQuil-induced dream or a fevered hallucination, but to me it was absolutely real. He was there, he spoke to me, and I felt very comforted by his presence. A few months later, I had a friend of mine from another school come visit for the weekend. We did some exploring of the house and found a hatch to the basement. It was filled with old tools and hardware. But one thing that stood out to me for no apparent reason. On the wall was a medicine cabinet absolutely stuffed with old pill bottles, regular things like Anisin and other old brand names that I had to look up. It also contained many prescription pill bottles that were too faded to read. For some reason, as soon as I saw them, my elderly visitor came to mind. I wondered if maybe he had some experience caring for a sick relative, and came to visit me when I was ill because it was a familiar situation. I did ask the landlord about previous occupants, but they had purchased the house only a few years earlier and didn't know much. I suppose I'll never know. Before my parents split up, we used to live in this huge old house. We lived in that old leaky house until I was around 14. The thought was to renovate the nearly 100-year-old house, but I guess life got in the way for my parents. The house had 2 floors, and all of our bedrooms were up on the 2nd floor. The largest part of the 2nd floor was dominated by the attic. It was a creepy attic filled with discarded things from both our family and the previous owners. I knew the attic pretty well, because although I was terrified of it, me and my best friend would hide things we shouldn't have in there. A stolen baseball bat, fireworks, and other things 10 to 14-year-olds should hide from their parents. The attic had an old wooden door that had a key in it. The door was always locked, unless someone was in there. My bedroom shared a wall with this attic. I had insomnia when I was a kid, or at least the doctors told my parents it was insomnia. One of my biggest secrets is that I slept with a nightlight on, hiding under the covers and pillows until I was 14. I would strategize how I would sleep, and make it look like the bed was empty by sleeping under the mattress, or by having my head under the pillows. The reason? Almost every night I would hear stuff from the attic shift and move. It often sounded like someone was rolling heavy balls or bowling balls across the floor in the attic. Sometimes I would hear knocks on the walls. Sometimes I heard what sounded like whispers. Me and my best friend would sometimes summon the courage to explore the attic in the daytime, always with the door open, never alone. I was obsessed with finding the balls, the ones I heard rolling across the floor. The other sounds I could write off as sounds a house would make, but the rolling balls and the whispers were unexplained. We never found the rolling balls, or any other source that could explain it. I'm sure there could be a plausible explanation, but I never found one. I do not believe in the supernatural, but for some reason I still get scared thinking about it. We moved when I was 14, and the first night after we moved, I slept with all the lights off, head on the pillow. I have slept well since. I spoke with my mother about these things a few years ago when I told her about the sounds. She grew a fearful expression and said that she didn't want to talk about it anymore.